Themselves into a frightening world where human flesh is the delicacy. This is Cannibal.
I wanted to know the taste of the human flesh. The young, beautiful girl's flesh. Just one bite of the hips. When you fall in love, you want to kiss her. It's just the same. I want to taste her. Really, it's the obsession. I'm a cannibal.
In all our eyes, the cannibal killer is the most horrific of all murderers. 4 of them became monsters of recent times. Andrei Chikatilo went on a 12-year killing spree which shocked Russia and the rest of the world. He murdered 53 people, mainly children, and he ate their sexual organs. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 young men. He cut up their bodies, cooked them, and served them up with vegetables. He would say that he did it for love.
10 years on each count. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Arthur Shawcross killed and mutilated 11 prostitutes and 2 children. He says he ate the genitalia of 4 of his victims.
When's the last time you had a nice roast pork?
Issei Sagawa conceived a fantasy of eating the girl he loved and carried that fantasy out.
I couldn't think my future, the future of my victim, nothing.
The acts of these 4 men are so alien that it's hard, sometimes repulsive, to face up to them. But it is the job of science and medicine to try and make sense of the apparently incomprehensible. In this film, we go on a journey of exploration through the childhood, mind, and brain of the cannibal killer, in search of explanation. Issei Sagawa is extraordinary among cannibal killers. One afternoon in Paris in 1981, he invited a girl he'd befriended back to his flat, shot her, and began to eat her. But while all other known cannibal killers are either in jail or dead, Issei Sagawa lives free in Tokyo. My film crew and I will soon be meeting him. When we look at the home movies of the Sagawa family filmed in the early 50s, Issei seems a normal, even playful child. But the picture is a deceptive one. As an infant, he probably had encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, and until the age of 2, he was in and out of hospital, which distanced him from his mother. As toddlers, the brothers look like twins. In fact, Issei is 18 months older.
As a
child growing up, did you feel different to other children?
Well, I was very weak. I was short, so I have a complex for other children. I think my mother has a sense of shame. So she tried to hide me.
A cannibalistic echo resounded through Issei's childhood. The home movies record an elaborate family game. Issei's uncle dresses up as a flesh-eating giant who pursues Issei and his brother. His father plays the knight who tries to rescue them. But the children often ended up in the giant's cooking pot.
When I was 3 or 4 years old, I was dreaming, bad dream, nightmare. I thought I would be eaten by my parents. It's the first steps of cannibal desire.
In recent years, Issei himself has been trying to understand his childhood better. He has, over the last decade, been corresponding with an English writer whose life's work has been delving into the minds of murderers.
Issei had a fixation on eating because, in the game, he was about to be eaten. So from then on, he associates pleasurable terror with the idea of being eaten. Now, to begin with, it was being eaten. Now, it probably didn't affect his brother at all, because his brother was perfectly normal physically and in every other way. It affected Issei because he concentrated and focused unhealthily upon that one thing.
As Issei reached puberty and the awakening of sexual desire, he retreated more and more to his warped inner world. The nightmares gave way to a peculiar fantasy.
In my mind, eat and eaten is the same. So I don't mind being eaten by the young, beautiful girl.
So you would like for me to eat you?
Yes. So that's a sexual desire for me. It's strange.
Sexual desire involved a complete fusion of his sense of beauty and his cannibalism. They were the same thing.
I tried to tell my brother when I saw the beautiful girl I want to eat, but my brother didn't understand. He laughed. So I was very ashamed. I thought I never tell to the other person. At that time, the obsession began. Obsession. It's a kind of obligation, sense of obligation.
How much were you thinking about it?
100 more than 100 times. I couldn't think another thing.
The trial of Andrei Chikatilo in his hometown of Rostov in the Ukraine produced a story of horror that seemed beyond belief. The murder of 53 women and children, the mutilation of their bodies, and even worse, the cannibalism. Chikatilo had eaten the sexual organs of his victims.
I think what's horrific and repellent about serial cannibal killers is the irreverence, the fact they've stolen other people's dead. we somehow accept that a murder will end in the act of murder, but serial killer cannibals continue long after the act of murder to eat bits of them. Relatives feel that their beloved nearest and dearest are embodied now in the perpetrator, that they have been incorporated physically into the cannibal killer himself.
But Chikatilo too was once an innocent child, and his childhood was, like Issei Sagawa's, marked by trauma. He had a difficult birth, which led to hydrocephalus, water on the brain, leaving his head misshapen. And the world he was born into in 1936 was cruel. The Soviet Union was plagued by the Great Famine caused by Stalin's forced collectivization of farms. 6.5 million are believed to have died. To survive, tens of thousands were forced into cannibalism.
For the Russians in the 20th century, cannibalism was not an exceptional event. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't remote, it was part of daily experience for a great many people. Nearly every family has a cannibalism story to tell. It could be that so-and-so's aunt was arrested because fingers were found floating in her soup. It could be that the man across the street was selling little beef patties, which turned out to be made of human flesh.
Many Russian children were exposed to tales of cannibalism, but only one grew up to be Chikatilo. In his case, there was one particular nightmarish story that would haunt him all of his life.
He told us he apparently had an older brother who was eaten as a child before Chikatilo himself was born.
His mother used to threaten him, "Don't go out or you'll be eaten like your brother was eaten." Whether this was more of a legend or a threat, we don't quite know. That had to have impressed him, that you could be eaten. It was a possibility.
This memory stayed with him to adulthood, even into middle age, when I interviewed him.
Chikatilo became a withdrawn child. He wet his bed till the age of 12, a sure sign of psychological distress. Being poor, the family had to share a bed. His mother daily berated him for the trouble his bedwetting caused. As if this wasn't enough, he discovered in puberty that he had a sexual abnormality that he found deeply shameful. He was unable to have an erection, and ejaculation could occur involuntarily at any time.
To discover that he was incapable of performing the sexual act came as a hideous disappointment to him and deeply wounded his self-esteem.
Despite this, Chikatilo grew, on the surface, into a model citizen. He became a school teacher and a family man with 2 children. But to conceive, he had to ejaculate on his wife, and then with his hand push his semen inside her. By his late 30s, Chikatilo had given up the humiliating sexual relations with his wife. Instead, the respectable schoolmaster became a paedophile, preying on those least able to defend themselves. As well as sexually molesting his pupils, he started stalking children at railway stations. Chikatilo was 42 and about to discover that the only thing that could really satisfy him was cannibalism. Jeffrey Dahmer, another innocent child, proudly filmed as he grew up in 1960s Milwaukee. He was born into a middle-class family, His father was a hard-working industrial chemist. But this little boy would one day kill 17 times, cut open his victims' bodies, preserve their skeletons, and towards the end, eat their thighs, biceps, and hearts. Once again, a familiar pattern emerges of neglect, trauma, and odd behavior.
His mother had no time for him when he was an infant. His mother was also alcoholic. She didn't touch her son, so that he didn't learn the interactions of human intercourse, which are essential if one's to have a tactile life, and if one's to have a life which recognizes other people as entities within themselves, and not just furniture, decor, to your life. That crucial human element which attaches emotional content to our actions was missing from him entirely.
Dahmer became alienated. His mother's alcoholism led to shouting matches between his parents, which he'd do anything to keep away from. At school, he was an outsider, always watching from the edge, never joining in. His interest turned to animals, but he viewed them very differently from how most children look upon their pets.
Whereas we would pick up the pet and hold it close to our chest and feel the warmth and pulse of a living creature and share the joy of that living creature in being close to us, he would put his fingers round the creature to find out where the bones were. To him it was something which fitted together, and he wanted to see how it fitted together.
Then Jeff started picking up roadkills, like dead raccoons that were hit by a car, or dead possum, dead dog. And he'd bring them back, and they had like a little cemetery there, like a pet cemetery for him. Then Jeff brought one dead dog back, and on his own decided to cut it open to see what was inside.
When one day he asked his father how he could bleach bones and put a skeleton together again, his father was delighted that he'd found an interest and thought, as indeed we might think, oh, at last, maybe he's going to be a scientist one day. So he encouraged him.
As he got to be 13, 14 and started having sexual fantasies, he said from earliest times, his sexual fantasies did incorporate in some odd way these dead bones of this animal.
At the age of 13, Dahmer discovered he was gay. Another trauma, as his family were strict Lutherans. But in a replay of his childhood fascination with dead animals, he began to conceive fantasies of sex with men who were not living, but dead.
None of us think about and decide the nature of our sexual orientation, and growing up we discover the kinds of attractions that we experience. A person like Jeffrey Dahmer, who's virtually incapable of being intimate with someone who's alive, who's attracted sexually to corpses, would never have decided to be that way. He's not that way because he was a bad little boy who decided to be different.
Confusion and loneliness led to the first murder. The breakup of his parents' marriage left him living alone in the house. Aged 18, he picked up a hitchhiker. They went home and drank beer. When the hitchhiker tried to go, rather than let his new friend leave, Dahmer hit him over the head, fatally. He managed to dispose of the body and was never caught. Now drinking heavily, Dahmer went to live with his grandmother.
He really loved Grandma, and he really admired her faith, and he wished that he could have it. And actually, when he came to live with her, she kind of got him into a little, regime of going with her to church, and for a while there, he felt that if he could just get into the Lutheran religion, that Jesus would save him. He thought he could put it all behind him with Grandma.
It would be 8 years before Jeffrey Dahmer killed again. When he did, he would be unable to stop. In 1977, at the age of 28, Issei Sagawa moved to Paris to study avant-garde literature at the Sorbonne. The tall white princesses of his fantasies were now all around him.
I'm very short, ugly, small man, so I always admire the big, strong, and healthy people, especially a beautiful girl, a white girl.
What he felt was that fulfilling his desire to eat someone would be a kind of such a high that he would never come down from it, that it would permanently transform his being, that it would fuse something inside him and he'd become a totally different kind of person, having had that experience.
With 2 months to go before he was due to return to Japan, Issei Sagawa met a 25-year-old Dutch student called Renee Hartfelt.
She was a very good friend for me, so I thought I must eat her.
At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of June the 11th, 1981, Renee visited Sagawa at his flat in Paris. Sagawa was waiting for her, armed with a gun.
This day it's very hot, very sunny day, and Rune, she looks very healthy. I felt a sunbeam penetrated in her body, and me, I felt very weak, very sick. So I want the energy of her, even the sunbeams. I took the gun and aim, and I fire. And she fall down on the table. There too much blood, and her face all completely pale. I thought I have to call the police or the ambulance, really. But suddenly I realized for my fantasy, I killed her.
He shattered at the sight of this girl lying there on the carpet and seeing the blood running from her neck into the carpet. He faints. It's only when he comes to that he says to himself, well, you've done it now.
I carried the body to the bathroom and I began to cut. I choose a little fork. I tried to pick, but I couldn't. Finally, I take the big knife and it push. Fat is like a yellow corn. And cut, and finally I could find the red one. I cut, and I put the red meat in the mouth. No smell. Very soft, like raw fish without smell. I remember that.
And did that give you a sexual release?
Pardon?
Did that?
Yes. After eating, I did. I kept some part of meat and fresh. I kept in the refrigerator. I ate sometimes, but I couldn't eat too much. And I tried to go to the restaurant in Champs-Élysées to eat normal foods, but everything it tastes the flesh of Rune. So I almost throw up.
And did you feel that you were absorbing the energy and sunlight within Rene into yourself?
It's just a fantasy, imagination. Not at all. At the moment Rune died, everything disappeared. The dead body is dead body. It's very, very dirty, sad. Yeah, it's very different from the living girl.
5 days after the murder, Sagawa was caught. His inept attempts to dispose of René's body in the Bois de Boulogne had led French police to his flat. Sagawa was examined by French psychiatrists. The emotional problems of his childhood emerged. But more significantly, neurological tests showed that either because of lack of oxygen at birth or infant encephalitis, Sagawa had sustained significant brain damage, in particular, injuries to a part of his brain called the prefrontal cortex. The French courts decided Sagawa was legally insane and unfit to stand trial. It would be 10 years before further research showed how important frontal brain damage in killers like Sagawa would turn out to be. At the age of 42, Andrei Chikatilo lured a 9-year-old girl to a hut he'd secretly rented just outside Shakti. After sexually abusing her, he silenced her by stabbing her to death and discovered he enjoyed it. Three years later, in September 1981, he struck again in some woods near the town of Rostov. This time, his victim was a teenage prostitute.
He tried to have normal sex with her, failed. She insulted his manhood, which was exactly the spark that he required to set off his rage. And he killed her with just whatever was handy, a piece of stone or brick, and just bashed her in. At the same time, he bit off her nipple in a rage, and swallowed it. And that was the moment when he realized that he was not only a killer, but a cannibal.
What followed was one of the most gruesome killing sprees of modern times. During 9 years, police found over 50 mutilated bodies of young women and children. In every case, body parts were missing. Uteruses had been cut out, tongues, nipples, penises bitten off.
This was a violent sexual monster whose appetite was for the actual sexual parts of the victim, to devour them. More than anything, in my opinion, Chikatilo was seeking vengeance. He wanted satisfaction, he wanted sexual pleasure, but ultimately, he even said that I took my revenge against life on the genitals of my victims.
In November 1990, the police finally arrested Chikatilo and sent him to Moscow for psychiatric evaluation. Psychiatrist Andrei Chikatilo believed that psychological explanations were insufficient. He decided to examine Chikatilo's brain.
Дело в том, что у него
The thing we discovered in our scans is that he had a whole range of neurological symptoms. These indicated that he had certain brain defects related to development before birth and others sustained during birth. In particular, we found that he showed signs of dysfunction in the front section of the right side of the brain.
What Tkachenko had discovered was significant wounding to the prefrontal cortex of the brain, just as in the case of Issei Sagawa. At this time in America, Adrian Raine, a neuroscientist, was researching frontal brain abnormalities in violent offenders.
The prefrontal cortex sits right above your eyes and just behind your forehead. In animals, only 3 or 4% of the brain consists of prefrontal cortex. In the human brain, it's 29%. The prefrontal cortex of the brain is a bit like the guardian angel on our behavior. It's really what makes us human and allows us to live and function in human societies without being aggressive. It stops us doing antisocial, aggressive, outrageous acts. We've always had the idea that perhaps damage to the frontal region of the brain may be involved in violent offending and in creating the psychopathic-like personality.
Neurologically, the prefrontal cortex acts as a controlling mechanism for the basic human emotions of anger and aggression, which emit from the limbic system, further back in the brain. In the early 90s, Adrian Raine did a series of brain scans on a group of 41 murderers in Californian prisons and compared them with normal people. The cool colours indicate poor brain function, and the warm colours indicate good brain function.
You'll see in this brain scan of the normal individual that the very top of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is highly activated. Now when we turn to the brain scan of the impulsive murderer, you'll see a distinct lack of activation in the prefrontal cortex. So we believe that there is something fundamentally wrong with their physiological, emotional circuitry, and that at a basic level there are brain deficits which in some ways account for the malfunction in the emotional circuitry in violent murderers and cannibals.
So the fact that Andrei Chikatilo could not only murder but mutilate and eat his victims may have been in part because of brain damage sustained at birth. But the Russian courts found Andrei Chikatilo sane enough to be responsible for his actions. In October 1992, he was sentenced to death. Two years before, in America, another cannibal, known as the Genesee River Killer, had been arrested. Now in prison, he prefers to be known as a real Hannibal Lecter. We went to interview him. We had 2 hours to see if he fitted the emerging pattern of cannibal killers. We're on our way to Sullivan Correctional Facility, New York State, to meet one of America's most notorious living serial killers.
6 o'clock, got in the car, drove 280 miles to a really weird meeting.
Most terrifying are the bare statistics. In 1972, Shawcross killed 2 children. He served 15 years in prison. Within a year of his release, he was killing again, this time prostitutes. He murdered 11 within 18 months, the last 2 on the same night.
Frightened that you know, what's he got to lose? He could just, in the interview, stretch over and grab my neck, or I don't see what there is to stop him doing that. He's in there for 230 years or whatever. It doesn't make much difference. Can I call you Arthur? Is that all right?
Call me anything you want.
Yeah, Arthur?
Just late for dinner.
My brother's called Arthur.
Shawcross parades himself as the real Hannibal Lecter, the baddest of the bad.
You know, you're in here now for how long?
I got 10 years, 5 months, and I got 239 years, 7 months to go. Right?
Shawcross claims he ate the vaginas of 3 of his prostitute victims.
Can you tell me about what cannibalism occurred with your victims, your prostitute victims?
Repeat that.
Did you cannibalize any of your prostitute victims?
3.
What happened?
What did I do? That's hard to talk about, lady. Well, I cut parts of the body out. One part, vagina, and consumed that. Why, I don't know.
There is disagreement on whether Shawcross's claims of cannibalism are true or a weird form of bravado. Autopsies showed mutilation in the genital area, but the bodies retrieved from the river were so decomposed that the evidence on cannibalism is inconclusive. Either way, it's become part of the legend Shawcross has created. On the internet, he has his own website, devoted to everything from his taste in poetry to his taste in flesh. Dr. Jonathan Pincus is the most recent psychiatrist to question Shawcross about his cannibalism.
I'm not sure why someone would claim to do that if they hadn't done it. And now whether it occurred as often as he says it did, whether it occurred at all, it's obviously something that gives him satisfaction to talk about and to think about and to pose about. Let's say he didn't do it. Let's say he's just fantasizing about the whole thing or lying about it. It really doesn't matter. Obviously, he wants people to think that he was a cannibal and he ate these victims. It represents his mastery over these women whom he killed, his complete control. It makes him seem important and unusual and I guess in his own mind, competent.
Shawcross was born to a US Marine and a teenage mother in 1945. He claimed at his trial that his life was blighted from the outset. Under hypnosis, he said he was an abused child, that his mother had forced him to perform oral sex on her.
Can you describe what happened to you as a kid?
My mother, when I was 4, introduced me to something I don't want to talk about in front of you as a female. You know, really.
It's okay. Honestly, that's what I said before, that...
Yeah, well...
If you can, I'd like you to be frank.
She had me put my head between her legs. And that's hard to talk about.
Shawcross's mother rejects these claims, and no evidence has ever been produced to support them. Psychiatrists can only confirm that severe disruption of the maternal bond can lead to antisocial behaviour. By 18, Shawcross had become a petty criminal, with burglary and arson convictions. At 23, he went to Vietnam. He claims it was there he first discovered a taste for human flesh. He says he tracked 2 Viet Cong women in the jungle, ambushed them, and tied one to a tree alive, while he cut up and cooked the other.
And I took the leg, the right leg from that woman's body, from the knee to the hip, took the skin off, took the cords out, and took the fat off. And it was only about that big around anyway. And I had crushed rock salt in one of my ammo pouches, and I sprinkled the water on it, and I'm staring at this other girl, because I don't know if she speaks English or whatever, or broken English. And I'm putting the rock salt on it, and I'm sitting there cooking over a fire, you know. And when I bit into it, staring this other girl in the eye, she just urinated right there, you know.
So what did it taste of?
When's the last time you had a nice roast pork?
A while ago.
I don't think you're going to eat it again, are you? If you take a fresh ham, a roast pork, and it's the butt end where it's a little burnt, that's what you taste like.
And why did you eat it?
I have no idea.
Were you hungry?
No.
If the Vietnam story sounds like fantasy, what is beyond doubt is that in 1972, now living in New York State, Shawcross committed his first recorded murders. He killed an 8-year-old girl and a boy of 11, Jack Blake. He later told a psychiatrist he ate the boy's penis.
That I won't talk about.
Why is that?
Because I won't talk about it.
It's just that, you see, we're trying to make this film about cannibalism to understand.
But that has nothing to do with that section of my life in Watertown, New York. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm referring to Jack Blake.
I have no idea. That I don't even talk about.
Is that because you feel...
Like I said, I won't talk about it.
Okay.
Mum's the word.
Shawcross's reticence may be sheer cunning. To admit paedophilia brings only loathing, but to be a cannibal killer of prostitutes makes him infamous. Talking about eating human flesh presents no problem.
It doesn't bother you at all?
No. I think about a lot of things, but for some reason, I don't have a conscience. I don't have remorse for anything.
After Shawcross's arrest in early 1990, psychiatrist Richard Krauss was commissioned by the defense to carry out tests on Shawcross's mental and physical state. The results were remarkable.
Specifically, I found 3 major areas of impairment. Number 1, genetically he's abnormal. Something in the order of, I think, 1 in 1,000 male births will be an XYY. In prison, you will find them in the order of 10 to 20 per thousand. Secondly, he has very high levels of a chemical called cryptopyrrole.
Cryptopyrrole is a chemical produced in the liver from an abnormal breakdown of red blood cells. If it appears in the bloodstream, it is normally excreted in urine. It has similarities with the drug LSD and impairs the functioning of the brain. Arthur Shawcross turned out to have 4 times the average amount.
When these cryptopyrroles are very elevated, it is directly associated with a great deal of emotional instability and depression and moodiness and a host of other symptoms and behavioral changes, including violence. And this seemed to be, to me, the second key in beginning to move towards an explanation of Arthur Shawcross.
When I was 18, I got hit here by a sledgehammer.
And then on top of that, he had clearly demonstrated brain damage to the frontal parts of his brain from injuries that he'd sustained over the years.
And he was knocked out and had to be taken to the hospital. Now, that sounds like significant head injury to me. And he's got the scars to prove it.
This one here, where the guy hit with a discus in high school.
And where's the other one from the
This
sledgehammer?
indentation right here is where I got hit with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, I can feel it.
4 different types of brain imaging confirmed that the 2 severe blows left permanent scars on Shawcross's frontal lobe, which contains the prefrontal cortex.
In the cases of Shawcross, Sagawa, Chikatilo, the common denominator in all 3 of these cases is frontal lobe abnormality. When we get completely outrageous, bizarre behavior like cutting people up, eating their flesh, it's not surprising to find in these cases that there is frontal lobe abnormalities.
My past.
Okay. Thank you very much.
See a ghost.
No.
Why are you shaking?
Good one, Art.
I'd tell that to everybody.
Physical brain damage may help explain why Shawcross, Sagawa and Chikatilo became killers, and their childhoods offer possible clues as to why they became cannibals. Perhaps the strange cannibal games played by the Sagawa family imprinted on Issei's psyche because he felt physically inadequate. Perhaps the story of Chikatilo's brother being eaten resonated because of his anger at his sexual impotence. All 3 cannibals suffered detachment from their mothers. All 3 felt the humiliation of physical and sexual abnormality. It amounts to a lethal combination of nature and nurture.
Your apartment, really nice.
But Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't fit this pattern. He showed no sign of physical brain injury.
I do that on Sundays. But,
Unpicking the path that led him to eat human flesh requires us to explore the deepest recesses of the human mind.
No, I've been surviving on McDonald's food for, since I moved down there.
Pat Kennedy has worked the beat in Milwaukee for over 25 years. Back in the summer of 1991, just weeks after he had been promoted to detective, he was assigned to the Jeffrey Dahmer case. His brief to get a full confession.
Hey ladies, don't let them get you.
When I first got there, the officers said, look in the refrigerator, which that's when I looked in the refrigerator, and that's when I saw just a regular cardboard box, and in the middle of the box, like sliced right here, real cleanly across, was just a freshly, severed head. And it was his last victim. He was a black male. His eyes and his mouth were, looking at me. I mean, it was weird.
Rather than disposing of evidence of his victims, Dahmer had collected it. From his flat, police removed 10 human skulls, some painted, some bleached. 2 complete skeletons. Torsos in various stages of dismemberment. Chemicals for bleaching and preserving bones. And in the freezer, zip-locked bags of human flesh.
I mean, he had it stacked up. It was obvious that he was eating. And as we found out later on, the last couple months before he was caught, the only meat he ate pretty much was that meat, and he would cook up some vegetables and potatoes with it.
The discovery shocked America. The obvious assumption was that Dahmer must have been driven by a terrible hatred. But perhaps the opposite is true. Alienated as a child, was Dahmer craving the human connections that had always eluded him? He hinted at a hideous logic behind eating his victims to Pat Kennedy.
In his own kind of sick way, he loved them. He didn't ever want to leave them. He didn't ever want them to leave him. By eating them, he's actually making them like part of him, and they were with him. They were like one with Jeff.
Although it's difficult to understand, certainly with the Western mind, cannibalism is one of the ultimate expressions of love. It is one of the ultimate ways in which you can demonstrate your devotion. If we're making love, we often indulge in a tiny bit of cannibalism with a love bite. And we know that the biting, the eating, is part of the gift. It's part of the gift that you're making, is to eat with a nibble on the neck the person whom you love. And you find it even with parents playing with their children, that they will get on all fours going over the carpet with a toddler of 2 saying, "I'm going to gobble you up."
So was Dahmer's cannibalism an extreme and literal expression of what for the rest of us is just a term of endearment? After the first murder at 18, Dahmer had tried to find solace in religion. It didn't work. Incapable of relating to people, but desperate for his own brand of necrophiliac sexual contact, in 1985 Dahmer started to hang out in gay bathhouses, where he would take his partners to a private cubicle and drug them.
He wanted a zombie that he could have sex with and not really have to deal with. Kind of like fish, you know, he could just feed them and use them as he wanted.
He did no harm to the person who was drugged. He would run his hands over his body. He would speak nice things to him. He would hold him. He would, in a mimicry of the intimate, affectionate relationships that he knew other people had.
Word got around that Dahmer was drugging young men, and he was banned from the bathhouses. He resorted to using hotels. In November 1987, he beat a sexual partner to death. He claimed he had been in a drunken stupor, that the murder was accidental, and he had no memory of doing it. But it was the beginning of a deliberate killing spree that would end the lives of a further 15 young men.
It was almost a religious conversion in reverse. He began to think, perhaps this is my destiny then to kill. I haven't been able to stop doing it. Perhaps there is a devil. Perhaps this is the work of the devil.
Part of Dahmer knew what he was doing was wrong. Convinced that he was seeing the world through the devil's eyes, he started wearing yellow contact lenses. He trawled gay bars for victims, now bringing them back to his flat where he would always drug them unconscious before he killed.
Jeff said that he killed them by strangulation because he felt that was the most humane, and he really didn't want to hurt them. And when I said, you know, this seems kind of strange, don't it, Jeff? You're killing the guy and cutting him up. He goes, yeah, I know, but once they're dead, that doesn't make a difference.
He didn't hate these people. He'd had no animus against them. He had no reason to resent them. There was no question of jealousy or anger. There was no degree of theft. He had nothing but admiration for them. The dead body to him was an object of beauty, something to be cherished. And the best way to cherish it is to retain it. So the best way he could retain it was what he'd learned as a boy, was how to use his horrible verb, deflesh the body, then retain the bones and put them together again.
For Dahmer, preserving his victims' bodies turned out to be not enough. Just as Issei Sagawa thought he would change himself forever by cannibalizing Renée Hartevelt and incorporating her into his being, it's thought that Jeffrey Dahmer hoped he would at last find those elusive connections with other people by consuming them.
He bought A1 sauce, and he'd have onions and vegetables, and he said, especially for like the hearts and the liver, he would just put a little Crisco oil on it, and he would just sear it on both sides, you know. He didn't like say it with relish or anything, but he did tell us how he prepared the meals and, you know, how he ate them.
In his final step, Dahmer drew on his religious background in a doomed attempt to commemorate his victims. This is his drawing of the shrine or altar he was in the process of constructing, complete with 10 skulls and the full skeletons of his 2 favourite victims, Ernest Miller and Oliver Lacey.
These are uncomfortable echoes, but we would be foolish to turn our eyes away from them, that the cannibalistic element in what he was doing were echoes of the religion which he'd been brought up with, in which, so Christianity tells us, we are meant to eat the flesh of Christ and drink the blood of Christ.
The body of Christ.
Not only symbolically, we've got to emotionally feel that we're eating flesh and drinking blood.
The body of Christ. The body of Christ.
The idea of eating a part of a person is regenerative. It's to give him eternal life, because he then becomes part of your own body. He's absorbed into your own tissue, and he is no longer dead. He has re-given life. Now, if it underlines our own religion, we should not be quite so surprised or horrified if it underlay also Dahmer's little private, perverted religion.
On Monday, Dahmer told a Milwaukee judge that he has seen the relatives' tears and that he expects neither freedom nor forgiveness for the murders of 15 people.
I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a Holocaust.
Did the defendant Jeffrey L. Dahmer...
In court, the awful complexities of Jeffrey Dahmer's perverse world counted for little. He was judged to be sane and sentenced to life imprisonment on the 15th of February 1992.
Over a 13-year period.
3 years later, he was beaten to death in prison.
Dahmer will receive a mandatory life sentence for each count.
Unlocking the secrets of what motivated Dahmer, Sagawa, Shawcross and Chikatilo is to begin to understand their cannibalism. To them it had real meaning, and it is the contemporary manifestation of a long human process.
The sorts of things that Chikatilo and Dahmer did are by no means historically unprecedented. The difference really is that they did it alone, but the sort of aggressive, cannibalistic, you know, eat your enemies thing, Chikatilo, or love people by incorporating them in death into your body, Dahmer, are things that whole societies used to do. Now it stands out because they are just single individuals who are aberrant, and we think, my God, this is some, you know, new and bizarre human behaviour. It's bizarre, perhaps, but it's not new.
Issei Sagawa is the only cannibal killer, neither dead nor in prison. In 1986, after the French authorities decided Sagawa was unfit to stand trial, he was deported to Japan to a psychiatric hospital. But there was nothing in the deportation order to say he should remain under lock and key. 15 months later, Sagawa discharged himself. He has been free ever since. Today, Issei Sagawa has celebrity appeal in Japan. He stars in pornographic films, writes restaurant reviews, and is a sought-after public speaker.
Issei has become Issei the monster, as far as most people are concerned, and can consequently never play another part. Issei's trapped in what he's done. Trapped almost as if he was in hell. He'll never get away from it.
Some people hate that I appear in public. They say he's cannibal, he's a murderer. Sometimes I ask myself why I'm alive. I should be dead.
To most people, it must seem that Issei Sagawa has got away with murder and cannibalism. But is he dangerous? The French psychiatric report drawn up after the murder showed that he had damage to the vital prefrontal cortex of the brain, damage shared by the serial killers Arthur Shawcross and Andrei Chikatilo. If there is a signature to the cannibal killer, can it really be eradicated by time? We showed the French report to psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Pincus. We did not tell him whom the report referred to.
Clearly he was neurologically impaired. He was not psychotic, but he was very, very obsessive. So to put that together, we have, I think, some hint of abuse, neurologic abnormality, and mental illness.
Do you know what he did?
No.
He cannibalized a Dutch girl over 5 days in Paris.
He actually did it?
But he had a fantasy to eat flesh.
And he was obsessed with the idea of it, and he finally couldn't control it, and he does have neurological, apparently, reasons for not being able to control it. His brain isn't working properly neurologically. And where is he now?
He's been released by the Japanese authorities. He's in Tokyo.
He's being released? Oh my God.
Issei Sagawa claims that he will never commit a similar crime again. Would you believe him?
I hope that he's right. I hope that he's right, but I have my doubts.
So, but have your relationships with women got better or worse since the affair? Much better.
Because I have now several girlfriends. Not girlfriend, but friend girl.
The Channel 4 book Cannibal, The History of the People Eaters is available priced $14.99. Order your copy directly from the Channel 4 shop with free delivery on 0870 1234 344 or click onto channel4.com/shop.